As always, the shiur is Leilu Nishmat Avimori Dover Meir Ben Ruben Halevi and Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michal. And tonight we are going to be talking about the Parshat of Chaya Sara. And if we look in the Torah, the Parshat of Chaya Sara contains 4 different chapters. And briefly, one of them is, the first one is the death of Sarah and her burial. Second one is Avraham sending somebody to find a wife for Yitzchak. Third is what I will call the last years of Avraham. And the 4th chapter, which we're not going to discuss at all, is basically the generations of Yishmael, which is almost is kind of like the Torah includes it to round out the family of Avraham, and then we move on from that. But I'm going to spend most of the time focusing on the first 2 parashiyot in the first 2 stories, if you will. And as always, I've tried to outline some similarities, some changes, some things that I wanted to focus on the Sukkim. And the first one is I really wanted to do a little bit of contrasting between the first story and the second story, and then comparing the 2. So as I said, the first, I think we're very familiar with both of these stories. The first is Avraham going about purchasing a burial plot for Sarah after her death. And the second is Avraham sending his servant to find a wife for Yitzchak. And I think the interesting thing about both of these is the sharp contrast between Avraham's role in the first one and Avraham's virtual non-role in the second one. So if we look at the storyline, I've highlighted, just to give you an idea as we go through this parsha, in purple is every time Avraham is actively doing something. A verb, Avraham. Avraham did something. So if you look through, you'll notice there's purple throughout this whole story, that Avraham is very, very active in the first story, which is chapter 23 in the Chumash. But it's the story of Sarah's death and burial, and Avraham takes a very active role in procuring that burial plot and the negotiations involved in doing that. The second chapter, interestingly enough, Avraham is virtually absent from. He has his dialogue at the beginning with his servant, and then the servant takes the role from there and runs with it and gets everything done. Avraham really doesn't even get mentioned as being in the story. And I thought that was a very, very sharp contrast if we look at these 2 stories. And the purpose, I think, of both of these stories, if we look at the Haftorah of the Parsha, which tries to give us a parallel story throughout the prophets that gives us a focus on what it sees as the primary lesson of the Parsha, I think we're talking about succession planning is clearly the theme of the Parsha, at least from the perspective of the Haftarah. The Haftarah tells us about David and while he is still alive, appointing his successor, appointing Shlomo as his successor. That's the Haftarah story. But if we look at these 2 stories that I just spoke about, each of them is Avraham, not necessarily succession planning, but clearly planning for the future of the Jewish people. So if we look at this first story, you say, well, what's he planning? What's he doing? He's buying a burial plot. But Avraham, in the way he purchases this burial plot, in the negotiation he goes through, is very clearly making a point, and the negotiations that are involved in that are to secure a piece of property in a land. Now we have to understand, he's living in a time where this is not necessarily something that is normally done. An outsider is accorded the right to purchase a piece of property. Normally, property owning was only people who were of the tribe or nation that was native to the area. This is why Avram has to specifically go and request permission, not just from the person he's buying it from. Today, you want to buy a piece of property, you go to the landowner, you say, let's make a deal, what's your price? And you buy it. Back then, it had to be written, it had to be confirmed by the local authorities. Okay, so if we go to the negotiations, it's interesting. We find three different parties that Avraham is dealing with. And I've highlighted them in three different colors. One, if we look in verse 3, Avraham is dealing with the Bnei Chet, the sons of Chet. And they first he asks, he makes a request of them. They answer him. And then if we go through verse 7, suddenly we have a new group introduced. This is the Am Haaretz. Now, if we look through, if we take today modern Hebrew, the phrase Am Haaretz generally refers to somebody who is not learned. However, in the Torah, in the Tanakh, Am Haaretz generally refers to some type of governing, of very, very local governing body. So when Abraham gets up and bows in verse 7 to the Am Haaretz, he is not bowing to the unlearned people. He's bowing to the town council, probably, or it may even be the zoning board, not really sure, but some official body that Abraham is negotiating with, who are part of or connected to in some way the local gentry, the Bnei Chet. Okay? Avraham now tells them, wait a minute. Okay, firstly, in verse 6, the Bnei Chet make Avraham an offer. Nobody we know will refuse to give you a burial place, a place to bury your dead. Your dead is lying before you. We understand the importance of burial. We are certainly willing to give you that. But that's not what Avraham wants. He does not want Sarah to be buried on land that is owned by somebody else, where he is requesting permission or has to get permission to bury her. He wants to purchase the land in which she is going to be buried and not have to deal. Excuse me. Yep. David and Avis, can you please mute unless you have a comment to make, because I'm picking you up in the background. Thank you. Okay, so Avraham here is dealing, as I said, with Bnei Chet as the local people in charge, and the Am Haaretz, which is specifically the town council. Presumably, that is some subset or some town municipal authority that is part of the town government. And he says to them, I want to meet this person, Ephron, who is the third party that he's going to be negotiating with. And again, Ephron at the beginning, who is presumably one of the Bnei Chet, as we read in verse 10, Ephron Yoshev B'toch Bnei Chet. Ephron was dwelling amongst the Bnei Chet. And he answers Avraham, he says, no, I'm not interested. You want this piece of land? It's all yours. I'll give it to you, and not to worry. But Avraham is still not satisfied with that. He again bows before the town council, and he speaks to Ephron again, saying, no, I want to pay the full price. This is very important. I have to pay the full price because I want ownership. I don't want to be using somebody else's property to bury my dead. Ephron agrees. He quotes him a price, and Avraham accepts the first offer. And it's interesting because if we were to think about it, the price that he pays, which is 400 shekel kesef, 400 silver pieces of silver. And why is my mouse working? Because I'm trying to highlight something. 400 shekel kesef, this 400 silver pieces. The sages say, "Whoa, what an exorbitant price he paid!" But the point Avram is trying to make is that the purchase of the property was to be made at whatever price was offered, because he did not want to haggle over the purchase price. He wanted to ensure that he was able to buy it, and that nobody would ever say, oh, he twisted his arm and he really didn't want to sell it, and he really didn't agree to that price. So Avram, by paying this full price, is able to guarantee that he has full ownership of this land. The commentator, Samson Farl Hirsch wants to suggest that the reason that both the Am Haaretz and the Bnei Chet have to be involved is because in addition to securing the purchase as a non-resident, as a non-member of the group that is the local residents, he additionally was asking for a variance. So there has to be two parties involved. One is the general municipal government, And second is presumably what we would today refer to as the zoning board, because he needs a zoning variance because this is not currently being used as a cemetery, and he wants to convert it from whatever its use was at the time into a cemetery. And that's why there are two different bodies that are represented, the Am Haaretz and the Bnei Chet. And if we look at the end, we find that again, and every time that we're going to see a reference throughout the Torah to Ma'arat HaMachpelah, it's going to refer to this field and this cave that Avram purchased from Bnei Chet, as we have at the end of the last verse in verse 20, Vayokam Asodeh. But again, the key point here is the involvement of Avraham at each stage. Avraham gets up from his mourning, he goes and he speaks to the Bnei Chet. He gets up, he gives the proper courtesy by bowing to them. He speaks to them. Again, each of these purple with a different verb relating to Avraham in his involvement directly in this purchase. Now we're going to go to sharply, we're going to contrast that as we go to the second chapter, which is the story of the servant going to fetch a wife for Yitzchak. Okay? The Torah begins this story by telling us Avram Zakein Ba Bayamim. Avram was old, he had come upon his days. Hashem Beirachet Avram Akol, Hashem blessed Avram and everything. So Avram realizes that Yitzchak is still single. If Yitzchak remains single, he's got no future. So he has to do something to prepare the future. Just like here in the first case, he is giving Sarah the proper burial and ensuring that that burial will not be destroyed by purchasing the land. So too, here he is ensuring the future of the Jewish people by making sure that Yitzchak finds a proper wife. But it's interesting in that he doesn't undertake to do it himself. He calls Avdo. Now, the interesting part of this whole story is key character, okay, of the story is this Eved, this servant of Avraham. And it's interesting, he's going to assume a number of different titles as we go through the story. So in the beginning, he is referred to as Avdo, Ha'eved. He is the servant who is having this dialogue with Avraham at the beginning of the parsha, and he is the one who is going to march forward and carry out Avraham's orders. So we begin with this position that Avraham is entrusting this servant with a very, very sensitive and critical, mission-critical job, because without a proper wife, there is no future for the Jewish people. And yet Avram doesn't undertake this journey on his own. He entrusts this servant, which says something about the confidence he has in this servant. Avdo is Zakan Beito. No, Avram Zakein. He is old. Yes. Okay. He's not so old. Okay. I'm going to tell you how I know he's not so old. He was firstly when Yitzchak gets married, he is 40. So Avram is 140. Okay. So by our standards, he's very old. But if we go back to the fact that his father Terach lived to the age of 205, that point, the average lifespan wasn't necessarily what it is today. And clearly the fact that I know that Avram wasn't so old, because if we go further on in chapter 25, we're going to find Avram's going to marry again and have a whole bunch of more children. So he's not so old. Okay. Yes, he's lived a lot of years, but he's not too old. The reason he's not undertaking this trip, perhaps, maybe some commentators want to suggest that he felt it was too much for him, but I think it's because he understands that he needs to stay back to continue whatever he has there to maintain his household where it is. He does not want to go back home because the allure of going back home may be something that he is not ready for. Not that he would have, but he doesn't want to have to deal with going back home to the old family. He can't go back, can never go back. So he sends his servant on this very delicate mission. But again, it shows us the confidence he places in this servant. Now, again, Midrash tells us, of course, this is his servant Eliezer, who basically is his charged affair, is in charge of all of his household. Hamoshel, as it says in the pasuk, Hamoshel b'chol asher lo. You can't come on, it's highlighting right there. Hamoshel b'chol asher lo. This servant is somebody who is in charge of all of Avram's property. Everything Avram does is under his authority. So clearly Avram has full confidence in him. But he doesn't have that much confidence in him because first thing he asks him is to take an oath. Vashpiacha. I want you to take an oath that that you will not seek a wife for my son from the Canaanites in whose midst I live. So he gives him this very delicate mission, verse 4, I want you to travel to my land, my birthplace, and find a wife there for my son Yitzchak. Okay, now, the first thing you're done, you're given this mission. First thing you ask is, okay, that's a nice mission. You want me to take an oath that I'm going to carry out the mission. He asks a question before the story proceeds. The servant asks a question. Wait a minute. Okay, you want me to go find a woman. What if she doesn't want? What if I find the right woman, but she's not ready to come? She wants to see the groom before she decides whether she's going to uproot her whole life and come live with him. Am I allowed to bring the prospective groom there to meet her? That's his question. Okay, in other words, if she doesn't want to come, I found the right girl, found the right woman, but she's not ready to come. Do I have permission to bring your son? And Avram says, no. Avram does not want Yitzchak to go there to be married because he does not want Yitzchak he wants Yitzchak away from the influence of her family. In other words, he wants to make sure that whoever this woman is going to be brought to Yitzchak to be part of his family, not vice versa, where he will be living in her neck of the woods with all of her family and relatives there to influence them. So it's not there's the servant is given a blanket no, okay, but Avram gives him a little bit of chizuk, I guess. He gives him a little bit of encouragement by saying the following. Verse 7, Hashem Elokei Hashamayim asher lekachani mibeit avi ume'eretz moladati. God, asher dibali asher nishbali lemor, who took me from my parents' house, from the land of my birthplace, and spoke to me and promised me, I'm going to give this land that we're living in Eretz Canaan to your descendants. Hu yishlach malacho lefanecha v'lakach v'isha livni misham. He will send his angel with you, and you'll be able to find a wife. So in other words, he promises him that with God's help, the mission will be successful. However, if you meet the right woman, you find the right woman, and she chooses not to come, the oath is off. You are freed from this oath. However, my son is not allowed to return there, no matter what. And it's interesting because he says, Rocket beneath the commentaries tell us that Avraham knew that ultimately Yaakov was going to return there, but Yitzchak is not to return there. Okay, Rocket beneath only my son. You know, my grandson will eventually get back there to find his wife, but my son not. Don't bring my son back. Okay, the servant is okay with that answer, and he takes the oath. That's the end of phase one. And from here on, Avraham leaves the picture, and we find the servant doing all the heavy work here of traveling, finding everyone, and doing the negotiation. But it's interesting because if we think about it, okay, the servant reaches the city, he sets the camels down near the well, and the first thing he does, where is my mouse here? The first thing he does is he prays to God. So we clearly see that this servant has been raised by Avraham or been in the household of Avram, such the fact that he knows what would Avram done when he reached this point. He would pray to God for help. So the servant takes up that same thing and asks God for help. And as we know the story, he says, he tells, I want you to I'm standing by the well. what happens at the well? Everybody comes out to collect water. Somebody's going to come out. I'll ask her to give me some water. She'll give me water, and without me asking, she'll give water to the camels. And if that's the sign, God, I'm asking you, send this girl out, send this woman out, whatever it is, and that's how I'll know that's the right one. Okay, because it appears that what he should have done, what we would have expected him to do, was to go to the well, wait till somebody shows up, say, okay, where does Avram's family live? Because Avram tells him to go to look among his family. It seems very strange that he picks randomly the first girl who shows up and asks her to go through this test. We would have expected him to go try to find the family, but he doesn't. And some of the Mepharshim want to suggest that the reason he doesn't do it is because he's got two jobs here. Very, very challenging jobs. One is he's got to find the girl, the woman. And the second one, which is perhaps the harder one, is he's got to convince her and her family to let her go meet her husband and accept him sight unseen. Okay, so that seems to be one of the things that is driving him perhaps to seek out this seemingly divine sign so that will help convince the family. And ultimately, we see that perhaps that does work, because later on we find that the family, while they might have been reluctant to let her go, they agree once he tells them the whole story. Okay, so again, the key here is that Avram trusts him completely, but he doesn't trust himself. He asks God for help, and he comes up with this method of trying to allow God to help him, if you will, of God showing him a sign that will help him out. Now, one of the things that we talked about last week in this story with Avram and his welcoming of guests was the fact that when Avram welcomed guests, it wasn't just, okay, here's some guests, here's some food. It was, he did it with speed, with energy, and we could see that from the words the Torah uses. Now, we see that same thing here in the exchange between the servant and this young lady who shows up. So in verse 17, verse Yudayin, we're told by Yoratz ha'eved likrata. As soon as he sees this girl, this woman coming out, young woman coming out, he immediately runs toward her because he feels as if, well, wow, I just finished praying and already, boom, somebody came out. That must mean that God is heard my prayers and has sent somebody out. And he says, please give me some water. Now, again, she says, sure, have a drink. But interestingly enough, he's in verse 17, he's ha'eved, he's the servant. In verse 18, he suddenly become Adoni. He suddenly become, as far as she is concerned, he is my Lord. He gets proper deference because she has no idea who he is. He's a weary traveler who is asking her for a drink. Interestingly enough, Avram uses that same term Adoni or Adonai to refer to the travelers, the visitors who came to his tent that we read about last week. Again, what does she do? Vatimaher. She hurries. Again, we find that she could have just said, okay, here's a drink. But she doesn't. She hurries. She lowers her pitcher and gives him to drink. So again, we see a lot of characteristics here that almost bring us back to last week's Avram greeting his guests with the way his servant is greeted upon his arrival. Again, when he finishes drinking, she immediately says, I'll give the camels water until they're finished. Without being asked, she realizes that, hey, he's a guy, he's come from a long trip. Camels probably haven't had anything to drink since they left, but they don't need it right away. But by now that they've reached a stop point, they probably want to get refilled. So again, if we think about 10 camels, I don't know how much 10 camels drink, but I'm sure it was not easy for her to go and fill up her pitcher time after time while all these camels drank their fill, assuming that they had been on a long journey. Okay, again, she does it with the same energy, the same enthusiasm. But to my hair, she rushes, and again, she does it again and again. And now again, suddenly the way we refer to the servant has changed. He's now referred to as V'ha'ish. He's lost his title as Eved by the fact that she referred to him as Adoni. He has suddenly been elevated in status. He is now Ish. He's now a man. He's not just a servant. He's now a man. And that's the way he's going to be referred to while he's interacting with her, primarily because she has made him feel this importance by calling him Shtei Adoni. So again, the Torah records, Va'ish Mishtala. Here he's the Ish. He's watching. When he finishes Vayikach Ha'ish, he takes out some jewelry to give her. And then he asks her, tell me who you are. And tell me if there's a place for me to stay overnight, if I want to stay overnight. Is there a place in your house for me to stay? She answers his first question first. She tells him she's Bethuel's daughter, and Bethuel is the son of Milcah that was born to Nahor, because she doesn't know how many generations back. She gives him a little bit of history. And then she answers his second question. Yeah, we got plenty of room. Okay. Again, Vayikod Ha'ish. At this point, he bows and he bends his knees, Vayishtachu Hashem, and he bows down to God in recognition of the fact that God has answered his prayer, because this young lady who's come out, not only did she do exactly what he asked, give him water and then give the camels water, but she also happens to be from the family. She's Nachor's granddaughter. Nachor is Avram's brother. Exactly what he wanted to hear. Okay. Now, in the next section, we suddenly get a new person introduced. Okay, he says, Baruch Hashem, he blesses God. And when she hears him mentioning that he is Beit Achei Adoni, that he is somebody from the household of a brother of her family, she runs, she runs and tells the household what's going on, that there's a guy showed up at the well, I gave him some water, and he asked me who I was, and he would like to stay the night, and let's find out what happens. Now, Rivka has a brother, and again, he runs. So we see again, running to Greek guests seems to be something that they picked up, that it's not just, okay, here's a guest, let's see what we can do, which again is a very, very important. I think if we think about the whole challenge that Eliezer, that the servant sets up here, it's not only to test, God per se, it's to see what type of person this person is. Because not everybody, most people, especially a woman seeing a guy standing by a well would say, come on, you're a strong, able-bodied man. Pick up your own water. What do you want from me? I'm a young girl. But she doesn't. She immediately gives him water. And Lavan, her brother, she has a brother, Lavan, who immediately runs. Again, he's still Ha'ish. He's still called Ha'isha. He's not called Ha'eved yet. And he runs to him and says, come on into the house. Why are you waiting out here? We have plenty of room in the house, and there's place for the camels in the stables, in the barns, whatever. Okay, again, Vayavo Ha'ish Habaita. He comes into the house. Again, he's still Ha'ish, and he gives the camel something to eat. And then he washes, and then they want to sit down and eat because they want to hear who this guy is. Somebody from Mishpach is here. Who is he? They don't know who he is. They don't recognize him because Avram has been gone for, I don't know, let's see, 50 plus years, 60 plus years. They don't recognize anybody. They didn't send WhatsApps every day with their pictures of everybody knowing what they look like. So somebody from the Mishpacha is here. Let's greet him. Let's welcome him. Let's find out who he is. And let's hear his story of why he's traveling here. And the first thing he does is he immediately says, Eved Avraham Anochi. Okay? So suddenly he's now going to be back to, you'll see interestingly, once he mentions that he's Eved Avraham in verse 34, suddenly he goes back to being the Eved, and Avram is now the master. He's going to refer to Avram 4 times, 5 times, a number of times. He will discuss he gives them background information, why he's there, that his master sent him on this task. And then he's going to tell them this whole story about what just happened and his prayer to God and how his prayer was answered and how she hurried. And ultimately, he ends with verse 49. After telling them this whole story, he asks them the following question. Now that I've told you my whole story, why I'm here, who I am, what brings me here, If you are going to answer, if you're going to deal chesed, if you're going to do kindness with my master, please tell me. But if not, if you're not going to let Rivka go, that's fine. I'm not interested, but I need to know whether I found the woman I wanted. Are you going to let her go or not? And ultimately they say, oh, well, what kind of business is this? Again, very interestingly, Mehashem Yatzah Davar. Clearly the hand of God is present in this to the extent that they recognize, again, because he's told them the whole story about how he prayed to God, how Rivka did exactly what he asked to do. Obviously, they see, okay, somehow God is behind the scenes in this. How can we say anything negative or positive? So they basically agree, and they say in verse 51, take her, and she should be the wife to your master's son, as of God has spoken. He's very happy. He brings out gifts, and then he immediately gets up the next morning, goes to sleep, and he gets up the next morning and says, okay, I'm going home. I'm finished with my mission. I want to go home immediately. They say, wait, no, give us a few times. She's needs time to prepare her dowry or prepare her trousseau, whatever. And then he says, no. God is with me right now. I want to strike while the iron is hot. Do it now. I want to go. And so they say, let's call her and ask her. And interestingly enough, in verse 58, they call her and tell her, ish hazeh. Now he's back to this ish again. He's back to being ha'ish. Are you going to go with this guy? And she says, okay, I'll go. Now, again, think about it. Think about her perspective. She's being asked to go, doesn't know who he is. He just said who he was. He could have been anybody. But he tells her the story. She is willing to go on his say-so. So obviously, his persona, the image that he projected was one of honesty and integrity, one that everybody seemed to accept that he was yashar. He was telling the truth. He wasn't making up a story to try to kidnap a girl or a woman. So clearly, the fact that Avram had complete faith in him was well placed. Interestingly enough, verse 61 is the most interesting of the psukim. It says, she goes after the man, because when in reference to her, he's the man, but Vaikacha Eved at Rivka, he in reference to her is now the servant, because she's now going to be betrothed to his master. He's now goes back to being the servant. Again, interestingly enough, there's that one place where he's called Ha'ish, as opposed to being called Ha'eved. Very interesting the way the Torah refers to him in these different ways as we go through this chapter. Okay. Ultimately, she meets Yitzchak, and the rest is history. As I said, the contrast between the two stories begs the question as to why is it that when it comes to the first story, Avraham is directly involved at every step of the way, and in the second one, he completely is passive, gives it over entirely to his servant. And I don't have an answer, by the way. I'm just going to raise the question. So anybody wants to draw out a thought as to why? Why is it? I mean, again, David mentioned the fact that he may have felt he was too old to undertake this trip, or that he didn't really want to, go back to the family. That's fine, but it seems to be such a delicate undertaking, and so many possible things that could have gone wrong. We would have thought he'd want to be there in person. And it may very well be, the simple answer may very well be the geography. Again, when it came to dealing with the burial place, he was right there anyway, so he's involved. Whereas this one, it's a long journey. He wants to transfer that to somebody else. As I said, I throw it out to anybody else who has any thoughts on why it is that, but as I said, it just seems the way the Torah specifically describes these two chapters and puts them right next to each other, that we really need to get a better understanding of why it is that Avram doesn't undertake that. As I said, it could be the simple reason.
The psychology of you feel so responsible of burying his wife. We don't value after they've gone, and we realize and responsibility.
Okay, so David was suggesting, I don't know if anybody heard, but David was suggesting that Avram feels this personal responsibility towards Sarah as his wife of so many years that he wants to do that personally. That's a very clear possibility that would certainly drive him to be directly involved. That makes sense because, and David also said that perhaps he wanted to. He found now that Sarah is gone. He realizes even more how much he's going to miss her and how important she was to his life and his lifestyle and his whole I guess mission in life. She was such an integral part of everything he did. So perhaps that might explain why he felt he had to be directly involved. I as I said, it doesn't, still don't understand why would he have. I mean, I understand why he would have been involved in that. I don't understand why he wasn't involved in the second one more directly. That's really the question, why he's able or willing to give this over. But I guess if we look at history, I think there's a precedent. Avram is setting a precedent to say that there are going to be times in history where geographically we are going to be separated from perhaps a Jewish community, and we may need to send a messenger to find us a proper mate. So maybe that's one of the things he's trying to teach us by sending his servant, his trusted servant, on this mission. Go ahead, David.
In the second instance, scenario is slightly different in that Hashem is involved, and Abraham is putting his faith in Hashem. He's sending an angel, well, the angel was not mentioned again, and Abraham understands that with the help of Hashem, he doesn't have to worry.
That's a good point. So by telling the servant that Hashem is going to send an angel, he's basically involving Hashem in the whole process, and therefore he doesn't feel the same perhaps nervousness or same problem that he will. That's a great answer. I like that. That's very nice. By getting quote, he's basically sending Hashem with the servant. So he's saying that therefore with both of them, there's no way the mission will not be successful. So he has complete confidence, A, in the servant, but B, A, in Hashem, I guess, and B, in the servant in carrying out the mission. I like that. That's a good answer. Anybody else out there want to make any suggestions?
Yeah, isn't this...
Ron, speak up a little. I can't hear you.
Aren't we ignoring Rivka's part in this? And isn't this a possible test for her in that here she is going with, if Abraham was there, it would be somewhat overbearing. She would definitely go because there's a direct link to her. But here she's got to have complete faith in this process.
I like that. It's good. You're suggesting that because had Avram come, she would have been overawed. By his presence, that she would have felt she had to come. Is that what you're suggesting, Ron?
Yeah, and this just demonstrates the face of our emote. The fact that she was able to,
that she's willing to come. That she's willing to come, even though neither Avram nor Yitzchak show up, but she's willing to come on her own with the servant. Okay, I like that. Good, that's a good suggestion. Thank you. Anybody else?
Alan, yes. I'd like to say something.
Go right ahead.
That thank you. That Abraham left his home because they were idol worshippers. How comes he sends back to this idol worshipping family to find a wife? He must have had lots of people around him who he converted, who he taught, who would have been suitable. Why does he send back to the family that he specifically left to find a wife?
I think that's a great question. If we look at Avram's command to the servant at the beginning, I'm going to go all the way back up to the top. It's very interesting because he tells him, I want you to go. I don't want you to take a daughter from the Benot Kanaani Asher Anochi Yoshev Bikir Bo. Okay, the key word there is bikir bo. I dwell in their midst. Okay, he is very concerned about Yitzchak taking a wife from anybody who lives in the neighborhood. Why? Yes, they're idol worshippers. Yes, the people back home are idol worshippers. No question about it. They're the same idol worshippers. But the difference is that the people who live in close proximity are going to far outnumber Yitzchak. In other words, her family is going to be significantly larger than Yitzchak. And if he is surrounded by, brothers-in-laws and sisters-in-law and cousins and uncles and all of this of a woman that he marries locally, he's going to have a lot harder time setting up his own household according to his rules, because they'll always be saying, oh, well, that's not the way we did it. That's not the way you did it. And he's going to have to go to the in-laws for all of the holidays and all of the family occasions, and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if he goes back to his homeland, he's not going back there every month in Gedornishtig to visit for family simcha or a chag, or come see us to help us babysit the kids, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's part of it. And interestingly enough, when the servant retells the story to the family, he very, very delicately changes that word. Let's go back here. If we look here, he says, Lo tikach isha, 1 minute. Where is it here? He says, he tells them that he tells the family that Avram told them, Lo tikach isha, asher anochi yoshev be'artso, in their land, not bikir bo, in their midst. Okay? So he changes it because he doesn't want them to think, oh, it has to do with the land. It has to do with them. It has to do with whatever, okay? He wants him to find a wife from his family, although Avram never mentions his family, by the way. Avram says, I want you to go back to El Artzi Vel Moladiti Telech. I want you to go to my land and my birthplace. He doesn't say family. Okay?
Right.
He doesn't expect, he doesn't know if he's going to find somebody from the family. But the reason he wants somebody from far away is because he doesn't want Yitzchak to have to be under the influence of her family. She needs to come here so she will be able to become subsumed and part of Yitzchak's family. That's the whole point that Avram is making. Okay? That it's artsy and moladity, okay? Not my family. He never mentions family. He just doesn't want somebody close where Yitzchak, it will be overwhelmed by all the family relations and ties, okay? Anybody else?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Anybody else? Questions or comments on this section? Because I want to have one more short section I just want to share because we talked about Avram's age. I'm going to go to the end of my little thing over here. 1 minute. Over here. After both of these chapters, chapter 25, which is the third parak as it's written in the Torah, tells us that Avram continues and he takes another wife after Sarah dies. Okay? He has a bunch of sons, they have grandsons, but Avram, again, just like we had in the first two stories, and I think this is the unifying feature that unifies this with the first two stories, is Avram takes care of the succession of the future. Vayitein Avraham, these two psukim that I've outlined in yellow. Vayitein Avraham et kol shelo Yitzchak. Avram gives all of his possessions to Yitzchak. He writes a will that basically disinherits everybody else. Yitzchak is the financial and spiritual heir of Avraham, the exclusive. To the sons of the other wives, Natan Avram matanot, he gives them certain gifts. While he, Avram, is still alive, he makes sure that they understand that they have no part in this future nation that's going to be formed by Avram. And interestingly enough, we see the importance in each of these three chapters of Avraham caring about successor, about future, about what is going to happen to the Jewish people after he is no longer here. And interestingly enough, if we study Jewish leadership. We find Moshe Rabbeinu doing the same exact thing. Before, when Hashem tells him, you're not crossing the Jordan, he goes and says, we need a new leader. And Hashem tells him to appoint Joshua. Joshua, however, when he realizes he's dying, does not appoint a successor. David HaMelech does, as we read in the Haftarah. And if we look through the success of the people who followed those leaders, we find that in Moshe's case, his successor, in David's case, his successor, were both very successful. They were both appointed during the lifetime of the person they were succeeding. So too, Yitzchak is able to succeed, I think, in part because Avram has cleared the way by removing a lot of obstacles, potential obstacles from his path. And I think one of the most important stages of leadership, one of the most important jobs of leadership, is realizing our mortality, that we're not going to be here forever, and taking care to make sure that we have made provisions for the future after we are no longer here, to try as much as possible to avoid problems among potential successors / heirs. And I think Avram teaches us that lesson very, very strongly in this week's parsha. And I think that's the real theme of the parsha. And that's why the Haftorah, as I said, was chosen from David doing the same thing by appointing Shlomo as king while David, is still alive. So that's it. I think we really have lots of positive lessons to learn, both from the servant, Rivka, but most of all from Avram Avinu in this week's parsha. And we hope and pray that we will all learn these lessons so that we can continue to grow as people and as Jews, and ultimately we will be Zocheh to Gula Shleima b'mher v'meinu. Thank you all. Any
Thank you.
final questions or comments?